Before we begin, allow me to paint you the full picture.
Elden Ring is a milestone for From Software in more ways than one. It outsold everything in the studio's backlog by a wide margin and truly brought Souls combat to the mainstream, but also caused uproar in the core Souls community like no game has managed since Dark Souls 2. While Elden Ring is rarely called an outright bad game like many people tend to do with DS2, more critiques have been written about it than Dark Souls 1 and 3, Demon Souls, Bloodborne and Sekiro combined. Though arguments such as the open world being too empty or the NPC quests being as vague as ever are frequently mentioned, the biggest, most persistent criticism of Elden Ring, and even more so Shadow of the Erdtree, is the quality of its bosses. Crucially, this criticism is heavily tied to difficulty. We finally reached the boiling point where even long-time Souls fans are saying that Elden Ring bosses are too hard, and this time, these claims are not universally met with a dismissive "get good." People are listening and plenty are agreeing. If you've watched my video on game difficulty, you already know what my stance on the matter is. Long story short, no, Elden Ring isn't too difficult and neither are its bosses. With how many different powerful options you're given to deal with adversities in this game, I'd say that anything short of enemies one-shotting you with a stare is feasibly beatable, if not outright easy. But of course, that's not what we're talking about here. Those playing min-maxed characters with meta builds and the fully upgraded Mimic tier aren't complaining about the bosses, and they aren't the ones writing YouTube critiques. Melee only, no bleed, correct?
Willful traitors. All.
To be clear, this is a perfectly legitimate approach to playing Elden Ring, as is any other. But whether you want to hear this or not, playing like that serves a large role in why you don't enjoy Elden Ring bosses as much as you did in other From titles. That's because Elden Ring isn't like other From titles. It's an open world. One of the most ambitious open worlds in gaming history, filled to the brim with basic enemies, mobs, ambushes, traps, and most notably, bosses. Dungeon bosses, cave bosses, ever jail bosses, bosses roaming in the fields, bosses flying down from the sky. Bosses, bosses, bosses. If most of these encounters were on the easier side, with the occasional jump in difficulty, the expanded game size wouldn't be nearly as grating on the player as it is now, and bosses like Malenia and Radahn would be seen as the ultimate endgame challenge, very tough but very rewarding, as were Manus, Fume Knight and Gao before them.
Siraj.
But in a game where Margit is easy mode and Hoarah is barely above average difficulty, a game where most will spend well over 100 hours trying to get a hit in between every single boss's inevitable 6-hit combo, Malenia and Radahn feel like the final whip on a long walk of punishment. Elden Ring is defeated by its own size. In a vacuum, its bosses aren't this apocalyptic blemish on From Software's legacy. They aren't worlds more difficult than bosses we've grown to love over the years, and they aren't the end of Souls combat as we know it. All they are is too many. Well-moderated difficulties where these games thrive. Sekiro is mostly agreed upon to be the hardest FromSoft game, and Saint Sword Ishin might still be the hardest boss they ever designed. Part of why Sekiro works and is so highly praised is because it's relatively short, doesn't have a ton of bosses, and the ones it has are nowhere near the difficulty of the Sword Saint. The one exception may be Demon of Hatred, which also happens to be the most divisive boss in the game. Now imagine Sekiro was 3 times as long, there were 5 more fights as difficult as Sword Saint and Demon of Hatred, and dozens of fights that match or surpass the difficulty of Great Shinobi Owl and the Guardian Ape. That's basically what Elden Ring feels like for someone who's not using all the tools in the game, and it's easy to see how such an experience can cross the line between an enjoyable challenge and an infuriating gauntlet. I won't go as far as to say Elden Ring was designed solely for the enjoyment of players who summon, use magic, the most powerful weapons and all sorts of buffs, but it definitely feels like the formula has been pushed as far as possible for those insisting on the old school Souls mentality of soloing every enemy with a two-handed melee weapon. It's not so much that Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree bosses are insurmountably hard playing this way, as it is that they are consistently hard for dozens of hours, and by the time you have to face the greatest challenges, you're worn out to the point of exhaustion, which inevitably leads to frustration and finally disappointment. It is a bit ironic that there is no hollowing mechanic in Elden Ring, yet it is the game most likely to push the Tarnished to the brink of hollowing, or worse, summoning the Mimic tier.
I am Melania, Blade of Mikola. And I have never known defeat.